In Clay County, Nebraska, there was an old water tower so ugly that people used it for directions. Not official directions, the kind folks gave when they wanted to insult a place without saying they were insulting it. Turn left at the crooked tank. That was what they called it. Crooked, rust-bitten, half-dead. And on the morning Roland Price drove his pearl-white Lincoln up Samuel Pike's gravel lane, he said what half the county had been thinking. "Samuel, that tower makes this road look poor." Samuel Pike was 66 years old, broad through the shoulders, narrow through the patience, and permanently stained by the kind of work soap only negotiates with. He was changing a cracked line on a stock trough when the Lincoln came crunching into the yard. He did not look up right away. A man who has 37 heifers depending on water learns to respect a leak more than a visitor. Roland Price did not wait to be invited. He stepped out in polished boots, silver belt buckles shining, white hat tilted just enough to announce that it had never been crushed under a tractor seat. Behind him, past the machine shed and the cottonwoods, stood Samuel's water tower. 48 feet of riveted steel, a timber platform patched in 2 places, a ladder missing 3 rungs near the top, though Samuel knew which ones, then climbed it anyway. The tank wore more rust than paint. One side had an old dent from a storm in '72. The wind vane on top squealed when the gusts came from the north. But every dawn, it fed water by gravity to 2 trough lines, the garden hydrant, and the little blue house Samuel had lived in since 1959. It had worked when the power failed. It had worked when the pump motors burned out, through 4 drought years, when newer systems around him sat silent and expensive. Roland Price saw none of that. He saw rust. "People can see it from my west pasture," Roland said. "I had investors here last weekend, Omaha people, serious people. They asked me whether the property next door was abandoned." Samuel tightened a fitting with a pipe wrench. "It isn't. That is not the point. It usually is." Roland's smile thinned. "You know what my new barn cost?" I heard several numbers. $82,000. Samuel nodded once. "Sounds expensive." "It shows pride." Samuel looked at the water tower, beyond the fence line. Red metal walls, white trim, big enough to house equipment that had probably never sat out in weather. Then he looked back at the tower. Roland pointed at it. "That thing shows neglect." The yard went quiet, except for the wind vane squealing above them. Samuel wiped his hands on a feed sack. Then he did something Roland had not prepared for. He smiled. Not warmly. Not apologetically, the kind of smile a fence post might make if it had just learned sarcasm. "You're right, Roland." Roland blinked. "I am?" "You are. It needs to be seen proper." Roland straightened. "I'm glad you understand." "I surely do." Samuel picked up his wrench. "I'll fix the visibility." Roland left believing he had won. That was the first mistake. Samuel Pike had not always been called stubborn. As a boy, he was called quiet. As a young man, careful. After his wife Marion died, people at church called him steady, because grief makes everyone kinder with vocabulary. But the men at the grain elevator knew the truth. Samuel Pike did not argue often because most arguments were a waste of daylight. When he did argue, he preferred to argue with evidence. The water tower was evidence. His father had bought it used in 1951 from a shuttered rail stop outside Sutton. The family hauled it home in sections on a flatbed and raised it with 2 neighbors, 1 borrowed crane, and a lot of shouting. For 36 years, Samuel's father had said the same thing whenever anyone suggested replacing it. Water that arrives without electricity is not old-fashioned. It is insurance. Samuel heard that sentence in his head every summer, when the power blinked out and his cattle kept drinking. He heard it during the drought of 1976, when 3 ranches hauled water in tanks, and Samuel opened his valve to a neighbor's herd for 2 weeks. He heard it in 1984, when an ice storm snapped lines across the county, and his kitchen tap still ran cold and clear. The tower was ugly. Samuel would not have denied that under oath. But ugly is not the same as useless. And Roland Price, with his bright barn and clean boots and investors from Omaha, had confused the two. So that evening, Samuel sat at his kitchen table with a spiral notebook and a cup of coffee that had turned bitter 2 hours earlier. At the top of the page he wrote, "White paint." Then he crossed it out. Too ordinary. He wrote, "Silver." Then he crossed that out, too. Too polite. He leaned back and stared through the window at the tower, dark against the prairie sunset. After a moment, he wrote 2 words. Sky blue, prairie sunset. After a moment, he wrote 2 words. Sky blue. The next morning, he called his niece Clara, who managed the farm supply store in Hebron. "I need paint," Samuel said. "How much?" "Enough to make a water tower impossible to miss." There was silence. Then Clara said, "Uncle Samuel, who complained?" "Roland Price." "That explains the amount of joy in your voice." "I'm also going to need reflective lettering." "Lettering for what?" "The side of the tank." Another pause. "What is it going to say?" Samuel looked out at the old tower. The working tank. Clara laughed so hard she had to set the phone down. By Saturday, Samuel had 20 gallons of sky blue enamel, 4 gallons of clear sealant, 2 rented scaffold sections, a pulley rig borrowed from the co-op, and 1 retired sign painter named Lester Mowry, who had once painted grocery windows before computers made handwriting expensive. Lester arrived in a tan pickup with 3 ladders, bad knees, and a cigarette tucked behind his ear. He looked at the tower. He looked at Samuel. Blue? Sky blue. Lettering? White. What should it say? Samuel handed him the notebook. Lester read it. The working tank. He nodded. Subtle. I wasn't aiming for subtle. The painting took 9 days. By day 2, drivers slowed on the county road. Before, Clara had sold 2 lawn chairs to women from town who said they were just out for a drive. By day 6, Samuel's neighbor Ben Hollis stood by the fence with his arms crossed, watching the tank turn from old rust to a blue so clean it looked like a piece of summer had been bolted to the prairie. "Samuel," Ben said. "Ben." "You making a statement?" Roland said folks couldn't appreciate the tower. That is not what he meant. No, but it is what he said. Ben looked up at the wet blue steel. "What's the lettering for?" Samuel pointed to the blank side facing Roland's pasture. "That's for him." Ben made a sound into his fist and walked away before it became laughter. On the 10th day, Lester climbed the scaffold with a brush and laid white letters across the tank in a script big enough to read from half a mile away. The working tank. Under it, smaller but still visible, he painted, "Since 1951. Samuel stood in the yard and studied it. It was not beautiful in the delicate way city people use the word. It was too honest for that. It was bright. It was blunt. It looked like a piece of equipment that had finally been given a name tag. Clara came by with sandwiches and stood beside him. "You know he's going to hate it." Samuel accepted the sandwich. "I know." "You know everybody else is going to love it." Samuel chewed thoughtfully. That would be inconvenient for him. But Samuel was not finished. Roland had said investors saw the tower. Samuel wanted future investors to understand it. So he built a sign at the end of his lane. Not a fancy one. 2 cedar posts, a painted board, white letters on blue. Working water tower. Gravity-fed cattle and household system. Operating since 1951. Please pull safely off the road. Clara read the sign twice. "You put facts on it." "Facts are harder to complain about." "You invited people to stop." "I invited them to pull over safely." "That is worse." Samuel drove the posts in at dusk. The first car stopped the next afternoon. A woman in a school district van took a photograph. Then a pickup stopped. Then 2 teenagers from town parked on the shoulder and posed under the sign, pointing back at the blue tank as if they had discovered a monument. By the end of the week, someone had posted it to a Facebook group called Nebraska Backroads. The caption said, "Old Farm Water Tower turned into the best landmark in Clay County." Samuel did not have Facebook. Clara printed the post and brought it over. It had 386 likes. Samuel looked at the paper. "Is that many?" "For a water tower, yes." "Good." Roland Price noticed on a Friday evening. He had a truckload of prospective buyers from Lincoln in his side-by-side, touring the edge of his place. He was explaining the barn, the new fencing, the imported seed mix in his pastures. Then the woman in the passenger seat leaned forward and said, "What is that blue tower?" Roland did not answer immediately. The tower stood beyond the west fence, shining in the late sun like a courthouse dome, built by a practical man. The white lettering faced him perfectly. The working tank. Since 1951. "That belongs to the neighbor," Roland said. "It's wonderful," the woman said. Her husband lifted his phone. "Can we get closer?" Roland's jaw moved. There's not much to see. But there was. There was the bright blue tank. There was the hand-painted sign. There was water running clean into a steel trough, where black cattle stood shoulder to shoulder, drinking in the evening light. One of the buyers took a video. In it, Roland's expensive barn was visible only as a red blur in the distance. The tower was centered. By Monday morning, the video had been shared by a local farm page. By Tuesday, the county newspaper called Clara to ask for Samuel's phone number. By Wednesday, Samuel was standing beside his tower with a reporter named Melissa Dane, who wore boots too new for a pasture and asked better questions than Samuel expected. "Why paint it now?" she asked. Samuel looked up at the tank. Somebody mistook rust for failure. Melissa wrote that down. "And what is it really?" Samuel pointed toward the trough line. A float valve clicked. Water poured. It is a system that does not ask permission from the power company. The article ran that Sunday under the headline, "The Tank That Kept Working." Melissa included the drought story. She included the ice storm. She included the fact that the tower still moved water by gravity, and had saved Samuel roughly $12,000 in hauled water, pump upgrades, and emergency repairs over the years. She also included one sentence Samuel had not realized would matter. New equipment can impress a visitor. Old equipment that still works can save a season. People liked that sentence. They clipped it. They underlined it. County Extension Office asked Samuel if they could bring a small group out to look at the gravity feed setup. A vocational agriculture teacher from Hastings asked if his students could come by to see how older farm systems were maintained. A man from a rural heritage magazine left a message. A retired engineer mailed Samuel a handwritten note explaining that the tower was an excellent example of resilient low-energy infrastructure. Samuel read the note at breakfast and said, "That man used 9 words where good tank would have done." Marion would have laughed at that. He almost said it out loud. Instead, he folded the letter and put it in the cigar box where he kept things worth keeping. Roland came back 3 weeks after the newspaper article. This time he did not arrive in the Lincoln. He came in a farm truck, which Samuel noticed before he noticed the man. Roland stepped out wearing the same white hat, but he removed it when he reached the yard. That was new. Samuel was greasing the hinge on a gate. "Samuel!" "Roland." Roland looked past him at the blue tower. The afternoon was cloudy, so the paint did not glow. It simply stood there, solid and impossible to dismiss. "I read the article." Samuel wiped grease from his thumb. "Lot of people did, apparently." Roland gave a short breath that might have been a laugh. "My buyers asked about it again." Samuel waited. "They remembered your tower better than my barn." "That happen often?" "Once was enough." The wind moved through the cottonwoods. Above them the tower creaked softly, a familiar sound to Samuel, a nervous sound to anyone who did not know it. Roland looked at the lettering, the working tank. "I called it neglect," he said. "You did." "I said it made the road look poor." "You did." Roland put the hat against his leg. "I was looking at the wrong thing." Samuel did not rescue him from the silence. Some apologies need room to walk in on their own. Roland nodded toward the tank. "That thing has been working longer than I've owned land. Longer than I've owned good knees. And it still runs without power? When the wind fills it and gravity takes over, yes." Roland's eyes moved toward the trough where cattle were drinking. "Mine went down last August when the controller failed. Took 2 days to get the part. I remember. You offered to run a hose over from your line. You said no." I was embarrassed. Samuel looked at him. "That's a poor reason to let cattle go thirsty." Roland accepted that because it was true. He stood there another minute. Then he said, "I came to say I was wrong." Samuel leaned on the gate. "About the tower?" "About what counts." That was better. Samuel nodded once. Roland looked as if he expected something more. Forgiveness, maybe. A speech. A handshake with music behind it. Samuel gave him something simpler. "There's coffee in the house." Roland looked surprised, then relieved. "I'd take a cup." They sat at Samuel's kitchen table while the old tower fed water outside. Roland drank black coffee from a chipped mug that had belonged to Marion. He did not comment on the chip. That was wise. After a while, he asked about the gravity line. Samuel drew it on a napkin. Elevation, float valve, overflow, manual shut-off. The kind of diagram that would bore a man who wanted shine and fascinate a man who needed water. Roland listened, really listened. 2 weeks later, he installed a backup gravity tank behind his new barn. He did not paint it blue. He did not put a sign on it. He just built it quietly and connected it right. No one made a speech about that either. By winter, the blue tower had become part of the road. People still slowed sometimes. A photographer came from Kearney and took pictures in the snow. The agriculture class visited and asked more questions than Samuel had expected. One boy with muddy boots and a serious face asked why more farms did not use simple backup systems. Samuel had expected. One boy with muddy boots and a serious face asked why more farms did not use simple backup systems. Samuel told him the truth. Because simple things don't sell as loudly as complicated ones. The boy wrote that down. Roland was there that day, standing near the back of the group, hands in his coat pockets, listening. Samuel saw him but did not point him out. The tower kept working. That mattered more. In February, during a hard freeze, power failed across 4 miles of county road. Roland's new backup tank held. Samuel's blue tower held. Ben Hollis lost a pump and drove over with a portable tank in the bed of his pickup. Samuel opened a valve and filled him up. Ben looked at the blue steel rising over them in the frozen dark. "Still ugly," he said. Samuel watched water pour into the tank. "Still useful." Ben grinned. "Useful has a way of getting prettier." By spring, the paint had weathered a little. The blue softened. Dust gathered under the platform. Birds sat on the rail and insulted the world. The white letters remained. The working tank. Since 1951, Samuel would sometimes see Roland's truck slow as it passed. Not to glare. Not anymore. Just to look. One evening in April, Samuel found a small envelope tucked under the lane sign. Inside was a photograph, hour at sunset, cattle below it, the white letters catching the last light. On the back someone had written, "My grandfather said old things only matter if they still serve. I think he would have liked this." There was no name. Samuel carried the photograph inside and set it on the kitchen shelf beside Marion's recipe box. He stood there a moment longer than necessary. Then he went back out to check the troughs. The strange thing about the tower was that paint did not make it better. The sign did not make it stronger. The newspaper did not make it more useful. It had already been useful, missed, and the point Samuel had spent 20 gallons of paint making impossible to ignore. Some people see rust and think the story is over. But rust can be a receipt. It can mean a thing stayed. It can mean rain came, wind came, winter came. Men came with opinions and left with cleaner boots than sense. And the thing still did its job. Samuel's father had been right. Water that arrives without electricity is insurance. But Samuel had learned the rest on his own. A thing that works for 40 years does not need to apologize for not looking new. It only needs one stubborn man willing to point at the proof. That summer, when the prairie went dry again, and the county grass turned the color of old rope, the blue tower stood above Samuel Pike's yard. The cattle drank. The garden hydrant ran. The trough line clicked and filled, and clicked again. And across the fence, Roland Price's backup tank stood quiet behind his expensive barn, doing exactly what it was built to do. No one talked about it much. They did not need to. On that road, people understood. Some men build things to be admired. Some men keep things that keep working. And every evening, when the sun dropped low over Clay County, the blue tank caught the light and gave it back, not like a decoration, like proof.